15-minute discussion.
Greetings, and thanks for joining us today. For those of you whom I've not met, I'm Steve Clemens. I'm Executive Vice President here of the New America Foundation. We'll also take a moment to say hello to our C-SPAN guests who have joined us today. Let me take a moment before I introduce today's program to tell you about some really interesting stuff that is coming up in the next week. As well, as many of you are here today because of the work that we're doing on foreign policy issues. On December 3rd, next week, we have a program, Korean Endgame. What should American strategy be to neutralize the North Korean threat? With three interesting and different voices on the subject: Selig Harrison from the Center for International Policy, Ted Galen Carpenter from the Cato Institute, and Don Oberdorfer, former diplomatic correspondent with the Washington Post, who's here with now with SAIS here in town at Johns Hopkins University. We have on December 4th, Stephen Glane on the subject of a region in play, the costs and consequences of a failed Arab economy. He is the former Wall Street Journal bureau chief for the Middle East, and that should be a very interesting program and relevant to today's event. And then on December 9th, we have a book event with a good friend and colleague who's been at New America many times, but Charlie Kupchan, who's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and also a professor at Georgetown University, on a very provocative but fascinating book called The End of the American Era. A bit of a counter trend there for those of you who are into this stuff. So we have a lot of programs coming up, and I hope you'll be able to join us in the future. Let me say a couple of words today about our speakers. Daniel Benjamin most recently was Director for Counterterrorism at the National Security Council staff, at least from 1998 to 1999. He is now a Senior Fellow in International Security Programs at the Center for Strategic International Studies here in town. He's an expert on terrorism and American foreign policy, focused a lot on the Middle East as well as Europe and South Asia. He was also Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and is an important new voice on the subject of transnational terrorism. And he was brought to us via a colleague of mine, a fellow here at the New America Foundation, Peter Bergen. This is not a corrupt thing. I mean, Peter did arrange for Daniel to be here, but I've made Peter promise that he's going to say some tough things about Dan Benjamin's new book, which he's going to be speaking about today. And Peter, for those of you who don't know, is a regular feature on CNN lately. He is their terrorism expert. He is the author of a best-selling book, Holy War, Inc., Inside the Secret World of Osama bin Laden. Peter is a prominent and important journalist. Has written about terrorism and militant Islam for Foreign Affairs, The New Republic, The Times of London, Vanity Fair, The Washington Post, and is simply, sort of everywhere lately. And Peter is also the person who, along with Peter Arnett, but really arranged the interview of Osama bin Laden in 1997. And I think we'll have a lot of important words to say today on our topic, which is American security strategy in the age of sacred terror. So without further ado, Daniel Benjamin, thanks for joining us. And show off your book.
Oh, yes. Well, first of all, I want to thank Steve Clemens and Megan Kiesel and Peter Bergen for arranging this. As the Post reminded us this morning, New America, the New America Foundation is, the hot New Americans, and has acquired a well-deserved reputation for thinking big and thinking out of the box. And I can't think of a better place to talk about things as big as paradigms in American security thinking and strategic studies. If anything should have become clear on 9/11, it is that a paradigm shift had occurred for U.S. national security. The security environment, everyone agreed, had radically changed. And perhaps the most succinct way to describe this change is that it was recognized by many that the foremost danger that the United States confronted was no longer a nation, but a terrorist organization, a non-state actor. To flesh out this explanation of or this description of a paradigm change, it seems clear that the old way of thinking about terrorism largely had to be discarded. That the belief that terrorism was a marginal phenomenon as far as grand strategy was concerned, and that it was an activity in which small numbers of casualties could be expected and a great deal of theater and a considerable amount of press, but no fundamental changes to America's standing in the world and no fundamental threats to American citizens or to our interests, was simply no longer tenable. The terrorists of 9/11 killed more people than had been killed, I think, in one day since Antietam. Killed more Americans, that is, in one day since Antietam, and it was a day from which we have not yet fully recovered. Instead of confronting principally politically minded terrorists, politically motivated terrorists, or terrorist cutouts for state sponsors, we were now facing a group that was religiously motivated, and that instead of trying to precisely pitch its violence, to calibrate its violence, it recognized no boundaries on its violence, indeed sought to achieve the maximum number of casualties possible. Instead of acting as, say, the Palestinian Liberation Organization or the Irish Republican Army or any number of other similar groups had in the past, it did not seek to find inclusion in a process of negotiation or mediation. It rather wanted to destroy any such processes, and perhaps its most notable characteristic was that it is completely undeterrable. 9/11 made this conclusion unavoidable. To a small number of people in the White House, the CIA, and a scattering of other offices within the government, this paradigm shift had been clear several years earlier. Certainly, it had been evident by what was a watershed for those involved in counterterrorism, the East Africa embassy bombings of 1998, where an indiscriminateness in the use of violence was evident, an indiscriminateness that did not translate into, was not carried over into a public understanding, but that was nonetheless clear to people who studied it and saw that any group that was prepared to kill a large number of African Muslims and to wound 5,000 people in order to kill just 12 Americans was prepared to act in a way that no group had before. About a third of our book, The Age of Sacred Terror, is about the effort to change people's minds within the government and in the public. I'm gratified that many critics have spoken of the book as an engaging tale of bureaucratic infighting, and I'm, like any author, abjectly grateful for any kind word said by a critic. But I have to say that I hope it is more than that. I hope it's also a book about just how hard it is to reformulate people's understanding of the foremost strategic interests of the United States. People use the metaphor of turning around an aircraft carrier. I think that in the wake of 9/11, one should talk more about the difficulty of turning around the American government, because it was really an extraordinarily difficult task and one at which we largely failed. Just to give you a taste of what is in the book and to mention some subjects that I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A, we discussed, for example, how hard it was to get the State Department to recognize just how enormous the threat was. Anyone who read today's paper, the Washington Post, on Saudi financing, let me tell you that in, I believe, 1999, we had a cable that was prepared to go out to numerous posts in around the world that was going to ask ambassadors to go to senior government officials and say that we needed to have far more stringent oversight of NGOs, because NGOs had become the #1 conduit for terrorist financing and for giving identities and safe houses and the like to terrorists. Despite the fact that the State Department had lost 2 embassies, it nonetheless became a very large battle within the government over sending this out, because many felt, and with some justification, that NGOs were the sole voice for democracy, and that we would essentially throw out the baby with the bathwater by having governments, many of which were not terribly democratic, come down hard on the NGOs. We made it clear in the cable that, in fact, we wanted no such overly stringent regulation, but that nonetheless this was an important area. In the end, the counterterrorism community lost that fight, and the cable was spiked. Similarly, when we asked in the aftermath of the August 98 bombings to deploy chemical and biological protection equipment, antidotes, vaccines, and the like to a number of embassies in what was known then as the Ark of Crisis, despite the fact that it was sent out by a White House tasker, in fact, in order to do this, it was never done, despite numerous meetings and an enormous amount of arm twisting by the White House. Similarly, INS had a visionary program for screening possible terrorists out of the large numbers of students coming to the United States. And it was a very proactive program. It was going to check all of their finances, where their parents were, any number of different profile attributes. And this program, which had initially been ordered up by Congress in the mid-90s, was killed in the late 90s because of pressure from an educational lobby, which enlisted the help of many of the senators who had originally voted for the first program. Had that program been instituted, at least one of the 9/11 hijackers would not have made it into the country. We talk about how the Department of Defense was notified by the NSC of failings in force protection at many different bases in the Persian Gulf, including weaknesses in ports where it was said that dhows or other small boats could come alongside warships and carry out a terrorist attack. This is one of the more amusing chapters. The memo went straight to Department of Defense. It was leaked within a day or so. It's still not clear whether that was leaked because of an effort to embarrass the Secretary of Defense or to embarrass the White House for meddling in defense affairs. For whatever reason, it was leaked and discarded. I mean, it was not paid any attention to. And of course, less than 2 years later, we had the attack on the USS Cole. Much has already been written about the book in the form of news stories regarding the deficiencies that we chronicle regarding the FBI. And so much, in fact, that I think I'm going to pass over that now and leave any questions anyone has for the Q&A. But suffice it to say that it was an extraordinarily difficult message to get across within the government. It was an extraordinarily difficult message to get across outside of the government. One of the arguments we make is that if there was a moment that America had a wake-up call, it was actually August 20th, 1998, when the United States attacked targets not only in Afghanistan, the terrorist training camps, but also the chemical factory in Sudan, in Khartoum, the Al-Shifa factory, because of information that had been received that chemical weapons activity was going on there. We go through this in great detail in the book. And as I'm sure everyone remembers, that was a particularly low moment in the history of well, I would argue the Republic, because all of the information that was delivered was essentially scoffed at by reporters, and the administration wound up with one of its greatest debacles. It was since revealed in testimony in the embassy bombings trial in February of 2001 by an al-Qaeda defector that, in fact, the group was working on chemical weapons in Khartoum. I can discuss more of the details of that afterward. But it's safe to say that America was a profoundly inward-looking country in the late 90s, unconcerned with external threats, and absolutely inured to the possibility that a new kind of terrorism had arisen and threatened the country. I'm afraid that, well, it is safe to say that there were an awful lot of people who didn't do their best before 9/11 in confronting the terrorist threat. And there's also a lot of truth that this was such a foreign kind of threat, such a bolt out of the blue, that perhaps it's unfair to expect too much. What I find really striking is that when we turn to today, the paradigm seems not to have shifted enough, or people's understanding seems not to have shifted enough, and we are sort of caught between two horses. Now, it's important to add that when paradigm shifts, the old one doesn't disappear. It continues on. It's a very confusing thing to have on the landscape, and we need to deal with a variety of different kinds of phenomena. We still have state sponsors of terrorism. We still have national liberation organizations. We still have, for example, Palestinian groups, which, when on the verge of achieving victory in a decades-old struggle, returned to terrorism. So it's a very confusing picture, but I think that after 9/11, some things still ought to be clear. And let me try to illustrate how I believe that the notion that non-state actors now pose the greatest threat to us has not been fully accepted, has not been fully digested. First of all, the discussion of terrorism today is still overwhelmingly dominated by discussion of states. Now, states are important. Terrorism exists because, or terrorism can take place because states either allow terrorists to be on their soil in many cases, or they support them abroad. But in the case of Al-Qaeda, this is not really so much true. There's virtually no country in the world right now that can really be said to be on the other side of the war on terrorism when it comes to Al-Qaeda. There are some cases that are not entirely satisfying. If we look at Pakistan today, it causes me a great deal of anxiety, and I'm not persuaded yet that we're anywhere near out of the woods there. And if you look at the recent elections, look at the people who are now prominent, look at the rhetoric, look at the celebration of Mir Aimal Khanzi, who was just executed in the United States. I think it's a very scary situation. But we can also talk about Saudi Arabia in a little bit. But basically, the rule of thumb is that every country is looking to be on the right side of the United States on this issue. Certainly when it comes to intelligence and law enforcement cooperation, the proof is in the pudding in abundance, I would argue. And it has been for a long, long time. There's been a lot of discussion lately of high-profile arrests. Well, in fact, high-profile arrests have been going on since 1996, 1997. The biggest Al-Qaeda catch ever was in 1998 when a man named Abu Hajar was picked up in Germany. He's incarcerated in the United States now, and he was the head of the weapons of mass destruction program and really one of the top 3 or 4 Al-Qaeda individuals. Now, he was picked up in Germany, but at the same time, there were lots of other people being picked up in the Gulf, in the Middle East, in South Asia, you name it. The reason countries, most of the international community has behaved this way is that they recognize that Al-Qaeda represents an enormous threat to their security. Al-Qaeda aims to topple moderate Muslim regimes, which the group views as being run by apostates and therefore intolerable. So from at the very top level, there's no question that there is that cooperation. When you get down into the issue of funding, it becomes much more difficult. I don't know of a country on earth that is overtly funding Al-Qaeda, but it is certainly true that in the Gulf we have a big problem, and we have a problem because the Saudi state is both the agent of modernization, but it's also owes its legitimacy to the promulgation of Wahhabi Islam. And so long as that is the case, it is going to continue to have these very large NGOs that send missionaries around the world and that have offices in every country where there are Muslims. And it will have rotten veins in those charities that will be used as conduits for money and men and materiel. Another problem with the funding situation is that throughout the Islamic world, it's very hard for Americans to get anywhere when they try to argue that funding for all terrorism needs to stop, and that includes funding for Hamas, for the Chechen resistance, and for the Kashmiris. And the reason is that there's almost no one in the Islamic world who views either Hamas or the Chechens or the Kashmiris as being an illegitimate cause, or sees their use of violence to be somehow deplorable. And as long as that continues to be the case, there will continue to be money that also makes its way to Al-Qaeda, because it's very hard to make these kinds of changes that we're proposing in the international financial system without pulling out all the branches, as it were. Perhaps one of the most important reasons why the understanding that this paradigm shift hasn't fully taken place is because of the linkage between Iraq and terrorism that has been made by the administration. There may be very good reasons for confronting Iraq, but terror isn't one of them. If Iraq is to acquire a nuclear weapon and try to redraw the geopolitics of the Gulf and surrounding areas, then of course that would be an enormous threat to U.S. interests. There's also a reasonable case to be made that for humanitarian concerns alone, it might be worth toppling Saddam Hussein. But my own feeling is that the decision to confront Iraq without any reference to the larger dynamics in the Islamic world and to the history of jihadism, which has really had its catalytic moments every time the United States stepped foot in the region, is a very dangerous one. And I don't think that the government has fully thought through what happens the day after. I mean, we've all read the stories about how the administration is averse to thinking about reconstruction. But I think it's also been averse to thinking about how Iraq will become a magnet for jihadists from all over the region. We've already seen in Kuwait and I believe also Saudi Arabia attacks on American soldiers, and I think that we will see that on a far larger and more dangerous basis. Additionally, I'm very worried that by not thinking about the enemy that is not deterrable and thinking only about the one that is partially deterrable, and I believe that is true for Iraq, they've overlooked the issue of what would happen to all of the weapons of mass destruction material during a war, because it's spread out in hundreds of locations, and it is not possible to gather it all at once. We don't have the special forces units that could do it all at once. We don't know where it all is. And a lot of that material is likely to get liberated in the fog of war. And I'm sure that there are security agency colonels and scientists who would like to sell it to the highest bidder. And that highest bidder will be Al-Qaeda. I don't think anyone should doubt. Let me also say that we are still looking at terrorism itself to a certain extent through the lens of the old paradigm. There's a feeling, I'm always struck when I talk to reporters, there's still a strong feeling that Al-Qaeda is a group like any other in the history of terrorism, that you could decapitate it and it would go away. Or that if you simply prune enough of the cells away, it will be incapacitated. Al-Qaeda is not a group like any other. It's not only a group, it's the bearer of an ideology. It's an ideology that's spreading with remarkable rapidity. One only needs to look at Indonesia, the scene of the most recent large-scale bombing, to see that. There was no large-scale jihadist presence in the country as recently as 9 years ago. And yet Al-Qaeda has managed, through the training of Indonesians and its links with groups like Jemaah Islamiyah, to establish a real foothold there. And just as it has moved to the periphery previously in Afghanistan, it will move to the periphery in Indonesia, and it will become a major theater of operations. Not only Indonesia, I should add, but also Malaysia, the Philippines, and it's already tried to carry out a major operation in Singapore, several major operations. Well, what are we going to do about this? It seems to me that there are a number of things that we should be rethinking. The most important one is the reorientation of our diplomacy. Historically, the two top concerns for American diplomacy in the region were security and stability in the Gulf and support for the peace process in the Arab-Israeli conflict. I think that what we have recognized, or what we should be recognizing, is that written above those 2 points should now be an understanding that what goes on in the countries of the region is every bit as important, because these have become incubators of anti-Americanism and terrorism. And that as they as they have fulfilled this function, they have also exported an enormous amount of it in their own efforts to protect themselves. That's why Europe has become a major front for jihadist terrorism. Well, what do we do to intervene, as it were, in countries like this? This is uncharted territory for the most part for diplomacy. But it seems to me clear that we need to work with these countries and exert what pressure we have to wean their education systems of their enormous dependence on religious institutions, which are themselves very involved in the inculcation of anti-Americanism. We need to direct international aid efforts so that the government can start educating its people and preparing them for the modern economy instead of preparing them for a lifetime of frustration when they come out, as they do, for example, in Saudi Arabia, in large numbers with degrees in religious studies that prepare them for no job at all. Additionally, I think we need to start talking about dealing with the what might be called the safety valve function of the press in these countries, which is also used to deflect attention from the shortcomings of the country itself and create an external enemy in the form of the United States, which is seen as the root of all the problems in the region. I, as a speechwriter for President Clinton, I watched time after time as leaders from this part of the world would come to the U.S. and we would go through, the bilateral meetings, and then at the press conferences, the president would again say, and of course we raised the issue of incitement in the press and so on and so forth, and someone in the press gallery would ask, well, what about this horrible statement that says, X, Y, and Z, and President Mubarak or someone like him from another country would say, but we have a free press, what can we do? Well, this just isn't true. It doesn't wash. These are government-supported institutions, and there's a lot that can be done. We need to look at the economics and demographics of this region because we're facing a long-term catastrophe. 50% of the population in the region is under 20 right now, and as this enormous youth bulge gets older and tries to move into the economy and finds that it offers them no comfort, we will find the threat of great instability. And there's already an ideology of dissent available to them, and that is radical Islam. The long-term hope, of course, is democratization, but I don't think anyone should have any false illusions about getting there. If we were to do it too quickly, we would perhaps hasten the very disaster that we don't want to see, which is very radical groups coming to power. No one has a roadmap from this. No one's ever figured it out. But I think that we need to set down markers that this is the direction we're going to go in, and we need to begin dialogues with these governments to make it clear that that's where they need to head. Otherwise, they face their own demise. We also need to recognize that the real issue is not functioning states, but failed states. My own feeling, and this is appropriate discussion for the New America Foundation, is that Al-Qaeda is turning into a virtual network, no longer needs geographic bases, but over the long term, it is going to be, the principal beneficiary of a principal beneficiary, I should say, of the digital age, and all of its operations will be secreted within cities and countries around the world, particularly as it finds more and more recruits among Western Europeans and the like who cannot be profiled or otherwise discovered. I guess I've gone on long enough. Let me just say in closing, old paradigms don't disappear. There's an overlap, but it's very important that we keep in mind just how much has changed. And it seems to me that because of the episodic nature of terror, because we can go a year or two without a catastrophic attack or more, it's very easy to lose focus and to think that it's a passing phenomenon. I think if you look at the websites of some of the jihadist groups, if you get copied on any of the mailings or look at any of the videos, you'll recognize that it is not a passing group, passing phenomenon. I don't agree with those who say that it was the death knell when the U.S. threw al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan by any means. And I think that this phenomenon is going to require an enormous amount of resourcefulness on the part of the United States if we're going to grapple with it successfully.
Thank you, Daniel. And now for comments, Peter Bergen.
Well, I don't want to take up too much time from questions. First of all, I want to really warmly recommend Daniel's book. It's incredibly well researched and well written. Moving forward just a little bit, there was a letter from Osama bin Laden which came out in the last week or so, which I think is quite interesting for the following reasons. We now know he's alive, obviously, but the 6-page letter in Arabic has been translated. It's on the web, and it makes, I think, the most coherent argument that bin Laden has made so far about why you should kill Americans, which has always seemed to be part, kind of there's a message problem here, since clearly there's nothing in the Quran that would justify the deaths of thousands of civilians. And he has 2 arguments for the following. Given the fact that the United States is a democracy and we elect our leaders of our own free choice, these are the same leaders that are perpetrating all the crimes against the Palestinians, the Iraqis, etc. So, Americans have a choice about the leaders they select, and our leaders are making choices which are clearly killing Muslims. This is a bin Laden argument. That's argument number 1. Argument number 2 is we pay taxes which support these policies. So the reason this is important is generally bin Laden, there is a pattern with bin Laden of producing certain kinds of statements which precede certain kind of actions. We saw this in the 98, bin Laden had a press conference in May 98 in which he called for attacks against Americans. He talked about good news in coming weeks. 9 weeks later, the embassy bombings happened. We saw it again with the videotape before the Cole explosion, in which bin Laden was calling for more attacks against Americans. Ayman al-Zawahiri, as number 2, called for attacks against Americans in the Arabian Peninsula, including specifically Yemen. Bin Laden was wearing a Yemeni dagger, which he'd never worn in any other picture. So, and then the Cole happened. We saw this also in the summer of 2001 with a videotape that was circulating. It was really the best exposition of bin Laden's views. The most thorough, comprehensive. It talked about the victory of Yemen will continue. The fact that you've got Ayman al-Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden saying, both obviously alive, both saying essentially the same things, attack American economic targets, I think is significant, because I think we will see that happening. And also, Dan just mentioned how the war is becoming more virtual, which I think is inarguably so. But I think also the target selection list is broadened, because you think about Al-Qaeda's philosophy, they were essentially they were at war with the American state. That's why they attacked embassies and military bases and warships. And a highly symbolic target like the Trade Center was almost something that was kind of something they just threw in. They obviously had no idea how the Trade Center was going to, how successful in their terms it was going to be. Bin Laden, who studied economics and public administration at university, did his sort of back-of-the-envelope calculations in an interview, which cost the New York economy, losses on the stock exchange, aviation losses in the airline business. He came up with a figure of $1 trillion. Ramzi bin al-Sheeb, the key operational planner, had much the same reaction in an interview with Al Jazeera in June. He talked about the immense damage that they'd done to the American economy. So this is a group that learns from its successes and its failures. And so, the American economic targets are ubiquitous. We just saw an attack on a McDonald's in Saudi Arabia. If you were running a McDonald's in Indonesia or Pakistan, I think you had to think very carefully about what kind of security arrangements you have, or a Kentucky Fried Chicken, or any kind of obvious American economic target. So I think we can make several predictions about the future, which some of them may even be accurate. One of them is that there will be attacks against American economic targets. They're ubiquitous. They are by definition soft. And that will be the new phase of the war. Attacking an American embassy now is rather complicated. If you go to the American embassy in London or Sweden or wherever, all the roads are blocked up, there are barriers, etc., etc. They are very hard targets. So I think taken together with these audio tape statements and bin Laden's letter, they're back in business. And as I think, as Daniel's very ably pointed out, they're not going out of business very soon. And I think, just in conclusion, I think one of the four things that make that true. One is they have a virtue that most Americans don't, which is patience. It took them 5 years to plan the bombings of the U.S. embassies. It took them 2.5 years to plan the 9/11. It took them 2 years to plan the Cole. So patience is one of their virtues, unfortunately. They also don't believe that God is on their side. They actually know that God is on their side. This is a very powerful form of knowledge. They are well trained. They're highly disciplined. One of the arguments that bin Laden wasn't alive is we hadn't heard from him. Well, I never really bought that argument, because this was a guy who was so disciplined that we know from the private videotape with the Saudi cleric, he turns around and he points to his Ari Fleischer, this Kuwaiti called Abu Rate, and he says, we didn't even tell him about it. So they didn't even tell the sort of top people in the group about 9/11. So the fact that bin Laden hadn't sort of demonstrated that he was alive, to me, meant nothing either way. It's simply that he was going to choose his moment. He may not be in very good health, but the statement came out at obviously a very interesting moment in the world. So with that, I'll turn it over to Daniel for questions.
Well, I'm going to have both of you come up for questions. Peter, thank you very much. Why don't we both, for the sake of ease here, have you both stand up. I'm going to field questions from the floor, and if you will identify yourself and your affiliation. But let me open the question. This morning in the Washington Post, it wasn't just about the New America Foundation today, although we were very proud of the article. On the cover is a picture of Tom Ridge, looking as if he just won a big football game and being slapped on the back, and isn't this great? And for something as serious as one would think of as the Department of Homeland Security and what its tasks and objectives are, that photograph undermined the spirit, I think, of what the administration should have been trying to convey. So this is a two-part question. What are your views now about the competencies of leadership in this new Department of Homeland Security, in the kind of line that you have laid out about what the grooves of our attention should be? And secondly, if we do take action in Iraq and intervene in a hot way, how serious do you think the distraction of resources and attention will be from the threat as you've defined it?
Good and big questions. On Homeland Security, I guess I regret the extent to which it has become a vortex for politics and the political process in Washington. It's an open question whether an agency with almost 200,000 people is going to do a better job. There are a lot of bureaucratic challenges. My own feeling is that there was a need for some kind of rationalization. But what we certainly didn't need is to have the war on terrorism become the war over the Homeland Security Agency. And I think it's incredibly regrettable that this was hung up for so long over work rules issues. I mean, it's just mind-boggling, and it reminds me that right after 9/11 we were having a hang-up over the federalization of workers at U.S. airports, and it just makes you think, well, if this is that serious, we ought to be able to do this a little faster, a little more efficiently. As I said, I do think there should have been some rationalization, but I think that insofar as the discourse has gone in this direction, we have done ourselves a bit of a disservice. The Iraq question is very important because it's often said, and appropriately so, we're a great nation, we ought to be able to do two things at once. That is true. We are a great nation. We ought to be able to do two things at once, but we still have limited special forces capability, and we have limited intelligence capabilities, especially when it comes to things like Arabic communications. And there's already a shift underway, and that will continue, and we will not have the special forces that we need to do the work in Afghanistan and the border areas with the Pakistani tribal regions. So, it's not a cost-free endeavor by any means.
Great. Let me take questions. Nick Berry.
Foreign Policy Forum. There are probably two objections to what you had to say. The first one is that there are a number of people that think that terrorism is an exaggerated threat. It is true, it is the most blatant threat we face without state actors being enemies. but they don't have weapons of mass destruction. They were terribly fortunate in 9/11. There is a growing urgency about tracking them worldwide and network. They are, if you will, on the run, and to exaggerate the threat seems to be hyping them, if you will, serving them. And that leads to the second objection, is that you really didn't mention too much the fact that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda are popular. They're popular because they see the repression of Palestinians, they see the occupation of Iraq, they see before oil for food the occupation of Saudi Arabia, they see before oil for food in Iraq, the death of really countless thousands. Shouldn't the swamp be drained? I mean, you counter terrorism not only by destroying them, but also removing their motives and interests.
Let me take the second question first. I hope that what I was getting at in the latter part of my talk was a bit about swamp draining. And I certainly think it is true, and it has been obscured from sight, that it is not only the small hard circle of terrorists that we need to worry about, but the enormous concentric circle of potential sympathizers, and there are an awful lot of them. And there's no question that we need to revitalize and reinvent our means of economic assistance, and we have a crisis coming in that part of the world. The entire Arab world, minus oil, produces less than Finland. So, it is a disastrous situation. There's no question that we need to do a lot to drain the swamp. Another thing that we need to do is reinvigorate the Arab-Israeli peace process, because although that is not a cause of terrorism, it certainly gives a lot of disgruntled Muslims additional reason for loathing America, or at least has been so cast for them. Well, is the threat exaggerated? I don't think so. I don't think so for a number of reasons. They got lucky on 9/11 because they tried an enormous number of times. They only have to win once for us to look like we're losing. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, interests are defined by perceptions, and the perception of the American public is that it's vulnerable. So that's another reason to take this seriously. Thirdly, they don't have weapons of mass destruction, we think, but they have a deep interest in acquiring them. They were working on chemical weapons in Sudan. They sought to acquire nuclear weapons. They have sought to acquire nuclear materials on a number of different occasions. There is an abundance of material floating around the world. I would have also thought one of our highest priorities now would be locking up as much of the material that's still in the former Soviet Union. We have Nunn-Lugar too, but it was almost forgotten for a year. During the Bush administration. So my own feeling is that they are undeterrable and therefore a higher threat, and that they're set a priority on killing as many people as possible. And they've demonstrated that this is not only in the realm of possibility, but as they're concerned, in the realm of probability and inevitability.
Thank you. I promise we'll work around the entire room, but because I've now been asked to rephrase the questions for our C-SPAN audience, I'm going to ask you to veer towards brevity. But let me get Roy Gutman from Newsweek.
Yeah, Dan, a question about the pharmaceutical plant, or sorry, the chemical plant as you call it. Was there all government agreement on the nature of the target and that the right target was hit? I know that you have a very strong point about this in the book. And secondly, just President Clinton is a major figure in the book and the policy after 1998. Do you think that he really shifted policy sufficiently? I mean, in retrospect, it's easy to say he didn't, but going back to your thinking at the time, did he really take this all seriously?
I'm going to really ask for brevity from other folks, but the first part of the question had to do with the Sudan pharmaceutical/chemical plant that was bombed, and was there an all-government agreement to proceed in that case? And the second part of the question had to do with President Clinton's shift in policy, and whether he was successful or not.
As for the Al-Shifa plant, the only person who did not cast a vote at the principals meeting at which it was decided to recommend to the president to attack the plant was the Attorney General, and she had a number of reservations regarding proportionality and preemptive self-defense issues, but she did not vote against it. As for the rest of the government, I haven't canvassed all the assistant secretaries, but there was a very small number of people who were involved in the deliberations, and I've never heard of anyone else who dissented from that decision.
I meant on the intelligence side. Was there an all-government agreement on the intelligence?
The director of Central Intelligence pounded the table in the meeting and said, we have to do this. And he was unequivocal about that, and afterwards, in all public discussions, he also was unequivocal, to the best of my knowledge. Did Clinton do everything he could? Well, I think a lot of people are going to have different feelings about that. I think that what we have tried to describe in the book is what the limits of the possible were. And absent a 9/11-like incident, it's profoundly difficult to move an enormous bureaucracy, especially one that is recalcitrant, has its own interests, and finds many ways to be evasive when the cameras aren't on. The funding level was virtually doubled in a matter of 4 or 5 years. He spoke about it endlessly. There were presidential decision directives completely reorganizing how counterterrorism was handled. My own feeling is that he worked very, very hard. As we also say in the book, his own problems did not make things easier. So,
Right here.
David Eisenberg, British American Security Information Council. One of the things you called for, recommended as part of the future solution was reorientation of American diplomacy in light of increasingly hostile anti-American acts, including actual physical attacks, funding of these groups, etc. What reason is there to believe, at least in the short to medium term, that any reorientation of diplomacy would do any good? Most nations seem increasingly mistrustful, even those nations we've traditionally regarded as closest, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Yemen, for example.
We need to repeat the question, if you'd like.
Would a reorientation of diplomacy make any difference given the hostility that exists out there right now in many of these countries? It's a good point, and I don't think anyone should have very high expectations in the near term. One of the disappointments to me was that at 9/11 everything was up for grabs, and it was a moment when we really could have changed a lot of things, certainly when it comes to dealing between governments. And I think that the most important thing is to start that discussion between governments. And I don't think anyone should have any illusion but that hostile acts are going to continue for a long time to come. But if we don't start moving the train in the right direction, it'll never leave the station.
David Kaplan from U.S. News and World Report.
Yeah, can you comment further about the role of the Saudis in financing terrorism? Has the threat, has their involvement been exaggerated, or are they really as complicit as the report suggests?
The Saudi story is a complicated one, and therefore always seems to get polarized when reported on, I'm afraid. The Saudi royal family, for the most part, understands, and when I say for the most part, I mean the important members in that 6,000 prince family, understand that when radical Islam's banner is high, then they're most likely to be the first ones taken out and shot. They understand that al-Qaeda poses an existential threat to their regime, and they have no intention of helping bin Laden or his followers carry out their aims. You only have to look at the various statements, tapes, audios, whatever, to understand how much bin Laden hates the royal family now. At the same time, the legitimacy of the also depends on promoting Wahhabi Islam around the world. And this is an enormous part of what the government does. And they have been incapable of really getting control of the charities, of rooting out the rotten veins. They're, I think, fearful of a backlash if they move too hard. It's not a government known for an enormous amount of spine. And if they seem like they're not moving fast enough to us, well, it's probably an accurate reflection of the situation, but we're asking a government to really re-engineer the fundaments of its legitimacy.
Peter, did you want to respond?
You know, I mean, just on the Saudis, not so much a sort of general statement. You know, one of the ironic outcomes of 9/11, which no one talks about, is that bin Laden's principal political aim is going to happen. You know, terrorists are rational actors. They're not doing this simply because they hate Americans. They think that there's a set of things they want. And we were talking earlier about one of the things, the most important thing what bin Laden wants is the United States out of Saudi Arabia. We have Carl Levin on the record saying, why are we there, the head of the Armed Services Committee. We have Andy Card saying on CNN, we're going to reduce our footprint there. We have the Saudis, many officials saying, we don't want you here. You can't use these bases. They've gone back and forth. You may be able to use it. You can't use it. We don't really know what those bases or that Sultan Air Force base will be used for. The fact is that Qatar is saying, turn us into a giant aircraft carrier. We don't really need to be in Saudi Arabia. But bin Laden's principal political aim will begin to happen. And just on the charities thing, you know, one of the 5 pillars of Islam is zakat. Zakat is giving 2.5% of your wealth every year to charity. Now, the reason that these charities exist is there's this giant amount of money looking for an outlet. And I think obviously, you know, it's a common argument these things are fungible. But the fact is you're not going to be able to basically change the Saudis giving money to these charities. I don't know what the police mechanism would be to make it stop it ending up in the wrong hands. It's a rather complicated issue.
Let me ask a quick follow-up question on this base issue. If you go into Google today and you type in William Cohen, Saudi bases, and controversy, you'll be taken to a set of articles that in 1999 Secretary Cohen began to change the way in which he phrased our staying power. And rather, where these bases had always been called temporary bases, he began to call them strangely semi-permanent bases. And so when you talk about the swamp, the reaction, was there any reaction within the White House at all? Because if you look at the ministers in Qatar and the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, there's an enormous visceral reaction against the using of those terms and a scrambling within the Middle Eastern press that I never heard a word about in the United States, and I've seen very few references to since. But clearly that sent a shockwave of some sort, a political shockwave in 1999.
I confess I don't remember.
Okay.
I wouldn't doubt it. You know, the issue is just a staple of jihadist discussion, but I really don't remember. And you know, it is part of their rap that, you know, they come, they never leave. And this is one of the issues now regarding Central Asia as well, that the U.S. forces have now, through the fight in Afghanistan, gained a foothold that they will never give up.
Ask other questions. Yes, right here.
Al Milliken, Washington Independent Writers. Is it helpful or harmful, or both, to proclaim Islam is a religion of peace? And is it wise to be ignorant of or dismissive of words in the Quran that terrorists take very seriously?
No, you can.
Actually, Dan has
If you'll repeat it, please.
The question, I mean, Islam it's like any great religion. I mean, look, Karen Armstrong wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs in which she said, you know, Islam is a religion of peace. And sure, yes, but there are, of course, when the sacred months are past, kill the idolaters, which seems like a pretty kind of go ahead and kill infidels, you know, in a certain time frame. So the Quran is full of all these possible justifications. One thing I would just say is that there is really nothing in the Quran, and you look at bin Laden's statements, there's not a single word that could justify 9/11. Even the most extreme reading of, I mean, when you have a jihad, there are certain things that you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to destroy roads or buildings or kill civilians, even if you accept the dubious notion this is a justified jihad. And I don't know if that really gets to your question. But the fact is, I mean, you know, the Old Testament and the New Testament are full of things, and Christianity is clearly a religion in which a lot of damage has been done in its name. So I'm not really sure how helpful the question is either way in the end, except to say that there is a lot to be justified both for good and perhaps for ill.
Actually, can I just add one
Yes,
thing?
sure.
One of the big concerns of our book is what is going on in Islam and also what is going on in the world, because the last decade has seen the rise of religiously motivated terror, not only in Islam, but also in every major tradition and in some of the peripheral areas of the cults. It was Shinrikyo was the first group to ever use a weapon of mass destruction on a large scale in a terrorist attack, the most strategic use of terrorism since the assassination of the Archduke in Sarajevo was the killing of Yitzhak Rabin by a religious student in Israel. There's something going on out there, and I think it's grist for an awful lot of anthropologists and sociologists. But what is also true is that Islam is going through an enormous amount of turmoil. We speculate that what is really going on is a kind of reformation, because you find a lot of people who do not have classical training essentially arrogating to themselves the right to interpret texts, and it's a very, very interesting phenomenon, and anyone who remembers the Reformation will know it's a scary phenomenon.
It's right back here. Yes.
My name is Shana England with no real relevant affiliation. I want to go back to your initial point about moving bureaucracy and the difficulty of doing that. I think we saw on November 5th what happens when you try and do that with sort of electoral grassroots education. And you seem to be indicating that it's not the Homeland Security Department. So then, if we take all of this, and even given the objections and all of that kind of stuff, you take all of this as true and as actually threatening and scary, and then the bureaucracy piece that you mentioned, then what? I mean, what do you do with this?
Try to repeat a piece of that.
Well, okay, if it's so hard to move the bureaucracy, what do we do? Is that the question? Well, we move the bureaucracy. And the way you do that is with a single-minded focus. In diplomacy, you usually only get your top-line request, and I think that in talking to the American public and talking to the bureaucracy, you're only going to get your top-line request, and I think that there needs to be a clear message about what the nature of the threat is. And we've so dissipated political energy through Homeland Security, through the resolution over Iraq. I mean, my own feeling is that, again, there may be good reasons to go to war with Iraq, but it certainly hasn't helped the cause of clarity regarding the nature of the terrorist threat, which to my mind is greater. So, I hope that there will be a good debate and that people will come around and see where the real threat is, and that that will move the government a bit more. I don't have any high hopes for the near term.
Bleak. Yes, sir. Right here.
Again, no relevant association. But my question is that I think that the question about moving the bureaucracy begs the question of moving it to where. And is the issue of terrorism really, is that the issue, or is the underlying issue the fact that Wahhabism and the spread of it is not a diseased vein of Saudi policy, but it is Saudi policy, and that perhaps we are the Islamic world is not about to become secular and democratized any sooner than the United States is about to become Islamist. So then, where exactly do we go to engage this part of the world, or to ensure our own security?
So just to repeat, the question is again about where do we take the bureaucracy to really confront the Middle East and Islam as it is today. I'm going to leave it there. Right. Thanks.
I don't think that we can or ought to suggest that the Saudis stop funding missionaries or teachers. What I think we need to do is insist that in funding those missionaries and teachers, they're not handing out dollars or reals or whatever to terrorists. And I think we need to recognize what the limits of the possible are, and not set ourselves a task that's out of the realm of reality. I also think that we're going to need to work very hard on the Saudis to bring forward their better side and recognize that if they want to continue to be the agent of modernization in Saudi Arabia, that this is the way to go. And otherwise, their own years are going to be limited because they will not survive this. And I think there's a lot of people who believe that.
Let me just follow up very quickly. Recently, Joschka Fischer, Germany's foreign minister, was in town, and they met with a small group of people, and they included people like Sandy Berger and Zbigniew Brzezinski and others. And interestingly, most of the former Clinton or Carter NSC type people essentially were criticizing and beating up on Fisher and Gerhard Schroeder for their strident position vis-a-vis not cooperating with us on Iraq. And they sounded very much like I would have imagined a neoconservative or Bill Kristol or Richard Pearl. Leon Firth was there and worked for Al Gore, and he had an exception. But the question is, when you make a case, or when you sort of look back at the Clinton administration and how it would respond today, and given what we've seen in Iraq, Fisher was saying, I don't see a Middle East plan. I don't see much commentary about what to do the day after. I don't see discussion of an exit strategy. All of stuff that a normal realist would sort of raise. And I'm interested, if you saw a different administration in place today, do you think that this sort of day after scenario would be discussed to a greater degree, given your experience?
This is a hypothetical on top of a hypothetical.
Yes. Well, it's Joshua Fisher's question.
Well, let me just go back and say I wasn't at the discussion. My strong guess, knowing some of the participants, is that the argument was probably about a sort of preemptive declaration of non-participation and a refusal to contemplate unfolding events regarding Iraq. My guess is that's where they were, and my guess is that they probably didn't disagree with Fisher regarding the big plan. There is one version of a big plan out there that's often attributed to civilians in the Department of Defense, and that is that if you knock over the Hussein regime in Iraq, that will lead the way to Jeffersonian democracy in Iraq, and 100 flowers will bloom throughout the region. As you might note, I have some skepticism about that, but I do think that the old line of let's not put cracks in the alliance when we don't have to is probably the one they were making. I don't see the big plan, and I think that in that regard, Fisher, who's a very shrewd and perceptive diplomat, is right.
In the very back, yes, Laura.
I'm a freelancer. Where do you weigh in on the ability of the FBI to transform itself into a more of a counterterrorist organization, or do you support this idea of a domestic intelligence agency?
The question from Laura Rosen was, where does Dan Benjamin weigh in on the subject of the FBI being to make? Is the FBI able to make this transition?
I was afraid someone would get to that. I think it's going to be very difficult for the Bureau. It's got an awful lot on its hands. Its cultural shift from investigation to preemption is going to be enormously taxing, as you saw from that leaked email the other day from the deputy director. They're a long way from being there yet. My own feeling is that we would have been better off if some of the discussion that went into Homeland Security went into instead the issue of domestic intelligence, because it gives us all the willies, and it's very good to have that discussion when the issue is hot, and the issue was hot after 9/11, and I think we've sort of lost momentum there as to what we can reasonably have, what the American people will tolerate, what kind of trade-offs with their civil liberties they would accept. I guess the jury's still out on where it should be, but my strong guess is that we need an independent agency to carry out that function, and one with an enormous amount of oversight.
Great. Yes, right here.
David England, and I'm representing myself. To what extent would a long-term plan to end our nation's dependence on foreign oil, specifically and more generally our domestic addiction to oil, free our hand to interact with states in the Middle East in ways that would serve the war on terrorism?
Good question. If you'll repeat, please.
If we reduced our dependency on Middle East oil, would we be in a better position? Undoubtedly. I get asked all the time, is this a war about oil? And I'll say, well, it's not a war in the first instance about oil, but oil is a consideration. And I don't think that we have to be ashamed about it in the sense that, it makes our economy run. It would be nice if we needed less from that region. It would be, that would be a fine reason to get our bases out of Saudi Arabia if it wasn't so critical. But the fact is that, that's where we are. Luckily, the long-term trends are towards a diminution of reliance on Middle Eastern oil because so much is being pumped elsewhere. It's not going nearly fast enough, and it'd be great if we could reduce that dependence.
Really quick.
Real quick.
Yeah.
You mentioned Middle Eastern oil, but as we shift to places like Russia, we will still be tied in terms of foreign obligations based on oil, which could have effects on the war on terrorism as it applies to other parts of the world.
This is the world we live in, and we're not going to be able to reinvent it, I'm afraid. One of the when we were writing the book, one of the issues we were debating was how do we deal with the Middle East when it seems to be in this reformation, in this enormously tumultuous period. And one of the ideas we kicked around was an effective quarantine. How can we just let it go through its historical changes that are necessary, and then move on? And the fact is, in the era of globalization, that's not possible with the Islamic world. It's not possible with Russia. It's not possible with anyone. We're just so interwoven and interdependent now that this is the future. I don't see any way around it, at least not for the very long, medium term.
Zeus.
Yeah, Zeus Yamianis. I'm really curious about your term sacred terror, because it seems like that was, I mean, it's in your title. You talked about it meaning religiously motivated terror, but do you have other meanings of that word that you could discuss? I'm thinking also the sacred elephant in domestic American politics could be a reference. Sacred terror could refer to that, or just this quasi-religious crusade done under the context of fighting terror for capitalism, spreading capitalism and democracy. Are those other meanings of the word wrapped into that term?
The questions from Zeus Yamianis is how many different meanings lie beneath the subtext of the phrase sacred terror?
Well, by the sacred cow or elephant of American politics, if you mean Social Security, no. No, we used the phrase sacred terror, and I should add that this book was begun in late '99, and until 9/11, it was entitled The Coming Age of Sacred Terror. We're really talking about what it is that the terrorists are thinking about, and how it is that they view their own mission, how it is that they view their activities as being on a metaphysical plane and not merely one of pragmatic politics, and what the implications of that are, because at the core of our study is the notion that there's no compromising over the sacred. And while, for example, moderate Palestinians may be able to come up with a new boundary between Israel and the territories, there is no boundary that is acceptable really to bin Laden, or at least it's so distant and so implausible that it is effectively non-existent.
Yes, right here. Last question.
If you've come across any concrete links between Iraq and Al-Qaeda?
Well, I mean, I think the short answer is are there any links between Iraq and Al-Qaeda? Well, Dan just had an op-ed in the New York Times, which I think sunk a couple of cruise missiles through the whole notion. But I mean, I can tell you from spending...
What date did that appear?
September 30th it appeared. Anyway, so I can tell you from my own research, I spent years looking into Al-Qaeda. One of the striking things, there are a lot of Saudis in Al-Qaeda, there are a lot of Yemenis, and there are a lot of Algerians. Everybody has a pseudonym. So your al-Misri means you're from Egypt, and al-Iraqi means you're from Iraq. The only al-Iraqi was actually Sudanese. And there may have been literally one or two other Iraqis. In fact, Iraqis play an incredibly small role, and in Iranians and Persians, there are almost none. The links, James Risen, I think, basically blew apart the Czech agent story. That's gone now. So I mean, there's almost no there, and it's unfortunate. I think the administration has muddied the waters. There was a period when they stopped talking about it for about 6 weeks, and then they started talking about it again. Presumably, Bush gave it his best shot in that speech in Cincinnati. A senior Al-Qaeda person had gone to Baghdad for medical treatment. I think it's very likely that a senior Iraqi Al-Qaeda persons had medical treatment in the United States at a certain point. I don't think it really means anything. I mean, if Al-Qaeda's in 60 countries, by the law of averages, there may be some in Iraq, but they're mostly in the no-fly zone. The no-fly zone is created by the U.S. Air Force. We're actually protecting those people, ironically.
Just to add a little bit to that, one of the things I noted in the op-ed, and it's noted in the book as well, is that when I was at the NSC, we undertook a study of the existing intelligence. My boss was a great questioner of received wisdom and said, well, the intelligence community is telling us that there's no connection between the radical jihadists and the secular-minded Iraqis. Why don't you go through the intelligence and tell me if they're right? And so I had 2 stacks this high with intelligence reports, and it took me a long time to go through it, and my colleagues, and we went through it for Iraq and Iran. And there's just not a substantive relationship there. There have been transits, there have been occasional contacts, but we never found any evidence of cooperation, of substantive cooperation. And, these are longtime enemies. Now, I think that in an existential moment for Saddam, things would change. But to date, I have not seen any convincing evidence. And I think if the administration really wants to go this route, it ought to be more explicit about what they have.
And let me just ask one final point that has to do with European politics and its connection to Islam. There's a debate going on about Turkey and joining the European Union, and that's not our decision here, but it's certainly the European decision. But I think a gentleman over here made the point that we're not automatically going to secularize this area of the world, but it is that nature, the question of modernity in this world, the question of reaching out to the silent middle classes or the silent middle class aspirant parts of those communities, and also of saying, here's a pathway. I see my friend Jean-Francois Boitin here, and his former president made the statement that if Turkey joined the European Union, that it would no longer be Europe. How important is this fault line of bringing someone into Europe? How important is it if Turkey ends up being outside the door for a much longer period of time? Are we hyping the stakes, or is there something serious here?
I'm a huge supporter of the Turks being in the EU. I spent 5 years in Germany, getting very frustrated when my German friends would say, "But it's not part of the Christliche Abendland. It's not part of the Occident. It doesn't have a Christian tradition." And to my mind, it's absolutely vital that the one very large Muslim country that is a good candidate for membership in the EU be in the EU. And I think it's just important for so many different projects, for security, for really the global project. There are certainly problems with Turkish governance to date, but my own feeling is that they ought to be encouraged in every way possible.
I want to thank Dan Benjamin. I'll show the book again, The Age of Sacred Terror. We don't have it outside, but I encourage all of you to pick it up. I'm sorry?
It is outside.
Oh, excuse me. You can pick it up outside today, and we'll leave Dan some time to sign copies if you like. I want to thank Peter Bergen, my colleague here at New America, very much for joining us. Thank you both.